So it's a praying mantis looking at a whole bunch of little bitty praying mantises, saying, of course, long before you mature, most of you will be eaten. And there's a lot of that in the basic idea of evolution by natural selection. And we connect the thrust of that particular idea to Charles Darwin. So Darwin, in the middle of the 1800s, born into a fairly wealthy British family. His father was a doctor. His mother may have had some health problems. A lot of stories that don't necessarily all connect to each other. So there's some question about some of the details, but I'm going to tell you what I think happened. So his father wanted him to be a doctor. He went to college, he started to train, hated the sight of blood, decided, maybe I don't want to do this. Went into the seminary to be a vicar, what we would consider to be a priest. That didn't work out. I would not be at all surprised if his father was giving him a lot of grief about not going into something that was a little bit more respectable, lucrative, whatever. But family drama, family conflict. He wound up on a ship, what we might consider an exploratory or survey ship, called the Beagle. Do you know how many ships you have to have when you start naming them the Beagle? This was the problem that the British Navy was having, is that they were throwing these ships, they had a navy, but they also were throwing these survey ships out all over the world to, find new places, stick their flag in places, bring back information. And the way that the Navy worked originally was, you get people from the lower classes to come in, they would be your workers, they would be your sailors, they would put the sails up, do all the other stuff. And then you had your officers, who basically told everybody else what to do. And the officers would be upper class people. And so you had a small group of upper class people running this large group of lower class people. Not all that different from society at the time. But so many ships, there weren't that many upper class people that were interested in being naval officers. And so they started to take sailors and promote them to officers to fill those slots, until it was getting very common that a ship would have the captain from the upper class and the rest of the officers and all the sailors would be lower class. And some of these captains had been brought up that you just tell these guys what to do. You don't hang out with them. They're not your friends. They're lower class people. And they would wind up being very, very isolated in these very long voyages, year-long voyages, more than year-long voyages. And some of them were getting iffy in the head. They'd get to a very nice South Pacific island with a lot of very beautiful women and go to the rest of the crew, go, bye. And maybe the people that they left behind on the ship were not that good at navigating or getting back where they needed to go. And sometimes they were just getting nutty enough that they were making bad decisions. They were losing ships. That's expensive. The missions are a waste when that happens. So the Navy was going to an alternative model. Instead of wanting upper class people who were naval by training, they would take people from the upper class to come onto the ship, and they would give them an officer title, and basically their job there was to be another upper class person to keep the captain company, to give him somebody else on his own level that he felt comfortable with, and maybe keep them from going as nuts over time. This is basically what Darwin signed on for. We're not really sure whether his father set it up in order to maybe make a man out of him, or he did it to get the hell away from his family, but he wound up on this ship. And when he got there, he looked at the things that people do on these ships, and he went, oh, naturalist, I'm trained in that. And the guy who was the ship's surgeon, who on paper was the naturalist, went, great, I don't really know what I'm doing here. They tell me what to collect. That's basically, if you really know how this stuff works, here, take the job. So that's what Darwin, he kind of signed on to be the captain's companion. He wound up being the ship's naturalist. Off they went around the world. I've got a bigger map of this. I'm going to put 2 maps up. So here's England. They sailed across the Atlantic, stopping at the Canary Islands, hit the coast of South America. Some of the places were on the mainland, some of the places were offshore on islands, bounced along South America, went around the southern tip, up the west coast, went out to the Galapagos Islands. There's an expansion of the Galapagos Islands. They turned out to be really important. Went across the Pacific, hit Australia and Tasmania, hit the Cocos Islands. I don't think they're called that anymore. Around Africa, back across to South America, and then back to England. So it took a long time, and it turns out that Darwin turned out to be tremendously seasick, never really got used to being on a ship on the ocean. And also, there's some indication that although he and the captain were equal societal levels, they didn't get along all that well. I mean, they were okay. They kept in touch through the rest of their lives. They sent letters back and forth because they shared this huge experience. So that was a big deal. But Darwin took any opportunity to get off the ship that he could. In fact, along part of this task, he basically said to the captain, I'm going to hire myself a horse. I'm going overland. Tell me where you're going to hit land, and I'll meet you there. So for a decent amount of the voyage, he actually was traversing the mainland, taking notes. And whenever they stopped, he'd get off and he'd, collect specimens, he'd take notes, and he started to notice patterns that eventually led him to his basic ideas about evolution. I'll put my other map up in a second. If you looked at the things that lived on the islands compared to the nearest mainland, this is one of the patterns he saw. That the differences in living things, you'd find stuff on the islands that were obviously related to things from the mainland, but sometimes they were different enough to actually be different species. And the level of difference connected to 2 features of the islands: how close they were to the mainland, and how different they were in what we would consider to be ecologically, how different the environment was. If it was cooler, if it was drier, if it was wetter, even if it was relatively close to the mainland, the way currents go, that happens, then you'd find bigger differences. And so he started to put together an idea of how these different species on the islands arose, when it's pretty certain that they arose as offshoots of the species that lived on the mainland. That was the thing about distance. The farther out the islands were, the harder it was for those original mainland species to even get any breeding group out to the islands. So any kind of mix of living things was going to be different on an island the farther away it was, because fewer and fewer members. And it's the mix that's also part of the environment. It isn't just the climate, the dryness and the wetness and the temperature. It's also the mixture of living things that you get that basically makes the 2 what we would call environments, the 2 environments, the conditions, different. And then he started thinking, so what's driving the evolution, the change from these mainland species to the species that I'm seeing here now? And he developed his theory of evolution by natural selection. How do things change over time? By how the world picks the winners and losers. That's basically what it amounts to. And he came back to England, and he became a professor. I guess at that point the drama with the family had kind of relaxed, is he became what we would consider to be a biology professor. And he developed his theories, and he wrote a bunch of stuff, but he didn't publish it. He let his friends, other science people, he was a member of the Royal Academy, they knew about his ideas, they had read his stuff, but he knew that this was going to be controversial, that there was going to be a lot of pushback from things like the church and religious people. And his wife was a religious person. He didn't really want to bring that down on his family. So he kind of didn't want to put that out there. Telling his scientist friends, when they were impressed with it, they saw the logic of it, that was enough for him. 20 years about he sat on this stuff. And then another guy. Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace. If you know how to spell Russell, they spelled it a little bit different. Alfred Russel Wallace worked here in Indonesia. He did a little bit of work in South America, didn't go too well. Is that before his ship with all of his specimens on it left port, it sank, so all of his specimens were lost. He was more of a commercial, he wasn't really working for the Navy, he was working more for what we would consider to be a company. But here in Indonesia is thousands of islands, all, different types of species on different types of islands. So he was basically seeing in this one area what Darwin went around the world to see. The same sort of influences, he came up with the same sort of ideas. He wrote it all up here and sent it back to England to be published. We know about peer review, right? People in the fields look at the stuff you want to have published. And pretty quickly, people saw Wallace's ideas and went, wow, these look really familiar. This is what Charles has been talking about for years. And they went to Darwin. And Darwin knew who Wallace was. They had gone, Wallace had asked him for some stuff, questions over the years. They had corresponded. They weren't friends or anything, but they kind of knew each other. And but Darwin's friends went to him and went, okay, this is going to get published. This is going to be the idea about evolution. But we know it's your idea too. So if you want Wallace to get all the credit and you want to keep this off, without connecting to your name, that's fine. But we think you should publish together, that you should both present the ideas together. And so Darwin went, yeah, I guess that's true. And so he sent a letter to Wallace and went, is this okay? We'll publish together. These are ideas that I've had for a long time. We have very similar ideas. It makes sense that we put them out together. And so that's what happened. Darwin had a whole book ready to go. He'd been writing about this stuff for years. First 70 pages were on pigeon breeding. His publisher looked at all the rest of the stuff and went, can't we just do the book on pigeon breeding? Because people love that. And Darwin went, no, we got to do the evolution stuff too. So both guys didn't get connected to the idea that strongly. Darwin was local, as he could follow up with a bunch of stuff. He had friends who would go out and defend his ideas. He didn't like conflict. He didn't like going out and defending his ideas against people who were against it. But he had friends like the guy named Huxley that they called Darwin's bulldog, who would go out and do these debates and stuff. But Darwin got associated with the idea much more strongly than Wallace did. We now associate Wallace with an idea that's called biogeography. He got much more into the relationships between the sort of things you find, just what we would call ecosystems, and the nature of the overall conditions of warmth and wetness and all that other stuff. And so Wallace is kind of considered the granddaddy of biogeography, but not really the granddaddy of evolution. But Wallace was really important. If Wallace had not come along, maybe Darwin never would have published his stuff. Maybe it would have been published after he died, probably not, because his wife probably didn't want that happening. Darwin eventually died of a parasite we'll talk about later that he picked up in probably when he was in South America, when he was in his late teens and early 20s. It took till he was his 60s to kill him, Chagas disease. We'll talk about that later. But this is basically the theory of evolution by natural selection that Darwin and Wallace came up with. How do species show up? In fact, Darwin's book was called On the Origin of Species. Fancy name for where do species come from. Oops. Okay, I'm not gonna write this all out. I'm just gonna put little bullet points and you can flesh them out. The first point that he made, you go out into the nature, and in any population of a particular species, all of the members are not the same. They vary. There's variation inside any group. And these variations include traits that we can see get passed on to offspring. Size, quickness, braininess to some extent. This goes back to the cartoon. Many, many, many more babies, seeds, spores, whatever you want to talk about reproductively. Your population consists of a lot of newborns that are never going to survive long enough to make their own babies. So there's going to be a natural weeding out of the population between when they're produced and when they get to produce their own. Those different variations include things that give an advantage to their possessors in the current circumstances. Whatever the normal conditions are, some are more likely to survive because they fit the conditions better. And the idea of fit shows up in Darwin stuff, what they call fitness, survival of the fittest. He hated that term, he only used it like once, but it's connected to this idea. The survivors are the ones that best fit into conditions. Now, the way that we've drawn on that is that, so what makes changes in a population? Well, if the conditions change, the survivors, the potential survivors are going to change. And it's going to pick survivors with certain traits that fit the new conditions better. And over time, as they kind of fine tune the survivors' recombined traits, this one's got this advantage, this one's got that advantage, the offspring wind up with the two of them combined. You wind up with a population that, when you compare the future population to the past population, your average individual's different. You go, oh, that's different species. Mammoth elephants. That, pretty much in a nutshell, is how this works. Is that the possessors of the advantages are more likely to survive. They're more likely to send those advantages on to offspring. Those advantages will combine when the offspring themselves survive and reproduce. And over time, you can change the nature of the group. There's a couple of terms that go with this. Darwin did a lot of work on the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos Islands about 600 miles out from the tropical western edge of South America. So a good long distance from the mainland, but they're in the middle of a cold current. So they're a cool, deserty cluster of islands. They're not like the rainforests that they're next to in South America. And what he found were some species that obviously had relatives on the mainland, but they were very, very different. And one of the things he found was a whole bunch of birds that were obviously all derived from finches from the mainland, what they call Darwin's finches, I think 13 different species. Some of them doing very different, very unfinchy kind of jobs, but they had moved into jobs that there were no birds there to do. There were finches that kind of took the positions of woodpeckers, but they didn't develop the woodpecker beaks. They actually grabbed cactus needles and used that to open up holes in plants and pull the grubs and stuff out. And the idea that this original group of finches could radiate to not just one species adapted to the environment, but a bunch of species adapted to different parts of this new environment is adaptive radiation. The example that's in the book are the iguanas. Nice rainforest iguanas, got to islands, no rainforest on the islands, but there were two ecosystems that they could kind of get by in if they had the right features. And over time, they got very good in those two groups. Upland, dealing with the cactusy dry plants that grow in the uplands, and marine iguanas that actually dive into the water and eat algae off of the rocks. Is that nothing like the green iguanas, except they're obviously iguanas. And that's adaptive radiation, this kind of movement from a starting group into not just one new species, but several new species radiating out. And of course, this whole idea I've been talking about is called speciation. Where do new species come from? Okay, that's a good place to stop for this. We'll pick up the follow-ups to Darwin in the next video.